Ruth est irlandaise. Elle est autrice et professeure à l'Université de Birmingham, au Royaume-Uni. Déjà à 18 ans, elle était primée pour son premier roman, Seven Forget. Et donc c'est quelque chose, donc elle a commencé assez jeune à entrer dans la profession. Aujourd'hui, elle a écrit 5 différents romans. J'ai 2 que j'ai grâce à Marie, que je peux circuler. Et mais si je donne un exemple, donc celui-là qui s'appelle Nine Folds Makes a Paper Swan, c'était comme ça que Marie a rencontré Ruth. Parce que je trouve toujours intéressant comment, avec le premier moment de rencontre, donc c'est pour ce livre ici. Et celui, donc The Butchers, qui est traduit aussi en français, la traduction en français c'est Les Champs brisés, qui a gagné le Royal Society of Literature, a Budgie Prize, prix des lecteurs du Festival de littérature européen, Cognac. Elle écrit aussi beaucoup de chapitres et pour The Guardian, qui c'est le journal que vous connaissez en Angleterre. Ambassadrice pour Narrative 4. Pour ceux qui ont fait Reach, vous vous souvenez de ce premier exercice qu'on a fait ensemble d'empathie, c'était Narrative 4 qui était initié par l'auteur irlandais Colin McCann. Et là, aujourd'hui, elle est en train de travailler. You haven't finished the play, right? Did you finish the play?
Finished the play.
She finished the play, bon. Donc là, on dit en anglais, ça marche en anglais, ça marche pas très bien en français. But she went from the page to the stage. De la page à la scène. Et le titre c'est We Love and Then We Drowned, qui est ouvert en janvier. Do you know where it's going to be?
Edinburgh. In August.
En août, le mois d'août. En fait, ça représente. Donc, c'est une autre transposition de son écriture pour travailler sur la scène. Moi, je suis ravie que tu sois là. On va t'écouter. On a aussi imprimé en anglais. Pour ceux qui ont un peu de difficulté avec l'anglais, si jamais il y a le texte aussi en anglais de son temps.
Avec des petits modifications.
Avec, ouais. Mais vous pouvez le garder. Donc, it's all yours.
Merci. Merci. Bonjour à tous et merci beaucoup d'être venu aujourd'hui. I'm really sorry, je parle français, mais je peux pas faire cette conférence tout en français. So, merci beaucoup pour votre patience. I will speak in English. I will try to speak slowly, like all Irish people, and there are some Irish people in the room. Normally, I speak very quickly, so I will try to go slowly. But yes, if it's easier to follow, please do. A huge thank you to the University for hosting me, as Gretchen said, to the wonderful Marie Mianowski for inviting me here and being so wonderful in every way, and also to Gretchen, Virginie, and all the team at MaCI. It's really just lovely to be here, and I'm delighted. As Gretchen said, I've published 5 novels. I've just finished my 6th and also my first ever play. However, obviously so much of the writing process involves sitting alone and thinking and researching and making up stories and talking to characters in my head. So I really relish the opportunity to talk to real people. So it's, to articulate out loud some of the things that have been preoccupying me. So yes, thank you so much for being here. However, I don't know about you, but the word that sums up a lot of what I have been thinking about recently is crisis. Even since I started writing this lecture, new wars have broken out around the world, new climate targets have been missed, new tales of doom and gloom have dominated the media. But rather than stand here and depress you, I want to use this time to reflect a little bit about the role of art and the artist in all of this, to reflect on my past experience of writing about crisis, and to gesture towards 2 particular questions with which I'm currently grappling in relation to writing in a time of crisis. So, as been mentioned, I'm the author of 5 novels, the most recent of which was The Butchers, or as it was in French, Les Champs Brisés, or as it was in America, The Butcher's Blessing, or as it was in Italy, La Maledizione della Vedova. Talk about an identity crisis. Very, very loosely, The Butchers is set in the Irish borderlands in 1996, and it centres around a group of men who travel around Ireland, killing cattle according to a set of ancient customs. I chose 1996 in part because it seemed to really encapsulate the clash between tradition and modernity with which the book is particularly concerned. For example, divorce was legalised in Ireland in 1996. Homosexuality had only just been decriminalised in 1993. The Celtic Tiger, that is Ireland's big economic boom, was just on the rise. And the Good Friday Agreement, which finally put an end to the savage brutality of the Northern Irish Troubles, was just around the corner. But 1996 was also the year of the BSE, or mad cow disease crisis. And in French, I believe it is La maladie de la vache folle, which sounds very romantic, but anyway. The epidemic dominated Irish headlines, caused numerous deaths, and decimated the entire Irish agricultural industry. And in revisiting that period for my research, I was only 8 at the time, so I remembered some, but not all. It was fascinating to see the way that the BSE crisis played out in Ireland, as opposed to in the UK, the implications that disparity had on Northern Ireland, and crucially, the starkly different ways the crisis was framed in the UK and Irish media. More generally, my research also reminded me how in times of crisis, societies tend to scapegoat their minority communities. So in the novel, the butchers are the ones who are ultimately blamed for the BSE outbreak, a false accusation which results in an act of terrible violence. The novel, was scheduled for publication on the 26th of March 2020. I was due to fly to Dublin and do a launch in my hometown and then return for another launch party in London where I live. Needless to say, neither went ahead. For by that stage, we were just on the precipice of our very own crisis, which I watched unfold with a mixture of horror and uncanny familiarity. For here again, it was fascinating to notice the way COVID played out in Ireland as opposed to in the UK, the implications that disparity had on Northern Ireland, and crucially, the starkly different ways that the crisis was framed by the UK and Irish media. And here again were minority communities being scapegoated as the source of the virus, often resulting in acts of terrible violence. What was less familiar, however, was the way in which people started asking me, in journalist interviews and podcast conversations and tedious online events, for advice. Their requests were completely earnest. They genuinely wanted to know what how I, a writer of fiction, recommended that they cope with the present situation, what I thought this meant for us as a society, how it might all play out in the long run. Of course, I was flabbergasted. I had no pearls of wisdom to offer, no nuggets of advice. Like everybody else at the time, I was confused and terrified and bored. I made banana bread and binged Normal People. I treasured the then dreaded those weekly Zoom quizzes with my family around the world. That said, I also knew it wasn't a new thing, this turning to novelists for guidance or insight during a period of societal upheaval. The Irish Times, for example, is forever getting writers to offer their opinions about X or Y or Z. Trump gets elected, Britain votes to leave the EU, and as well as interviewing political or constitutional experts, there is always a series of articles devoted to what the nation's writers have to say, their hot takes, their pearls of wisdom. And this cultural role fascinates me, and it got me thinking, both then and since, about the purpose of art and artists during crisis. On the one hand, it seems we have a tendency to confer real status on writers, or at least certain kinds of writers. On the other hand, in my own experience at least, such a status can feel misplaced. Like I said, I was a total mess during COVID. Being an author didn't change that. And I was also beginning to feel a kind of guilt because even whining about my cancelled book launches, about the fact that book sales were down, felt irrelevant compared to everything that was going on. The ultimate, as we say, first world problem. Since the COVID pandemic, the world has recovered-ish. But in its wake, I feel as if a series of crises have rushed in to take its place. On a global level, the climate crisis feels more stark than ever. The number of wars seems to multiply by the day. On a national level, in the UK, where I live and work, we are facing a crisis of the humanities, where university arts departments are completely decimated owing to vanishing student numbers, while the rise of AI threatens to destroy the cultural landscape as we know it. On a personal level, since COVID, I lost my father. I spent years writing a sixth novel that ultimately failed to sell. And I started dipping my toe in writing for the stage with my first play performed in London back in January. And this might seem like a slightly disparate array of events, but to me, they're very much interconnected, and they've shaped my thinking as a researcher, as an educator, and as a writer. So, as promised, I would like to discuss two particular trains of thought with which I'm currently preoccupied. The first of which I'm calling a crisis of form. Dun, dun, dun. Sound effects, please. So, in his now seminal text, The Great Derangement, Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh describes, quote, our cultural inability to think the unthinkable. He cites the relative lack of climate concerns in recent literary fiction, in part because the extreme nature of today's climate events are seen as incongruous with serious literature. Instead, calamitous tornadoes and apocalyptic fires feel more suited to other, less realist genres, such as science fiction or fantasy. Meanwhile, Ghosh diagnoses contemporary fiction, much like contemporary politics, as tending to focus on the individual rather than the collective, which he warns is unlikely to inspire the kind of communal thinking or action so desperately needed in the face of an overheating planet. In short, Ghosh states, quote, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture, and thus of the imagination. Now, as I'm sure many of you in this room can think, I too can think of various examples which push back against Ghosh's arguments. Published last year, Gurnaik Johal's debut novel Saraswati centres around a legendary river in northern India and is not told by one individual but via an entire kaleidoscope of voices. And meanwhile, the most recent novel from Sir Ian serious literary fiction McEwan, What We Can Know, is all about a pair of academics working in post-climate catastrophe Britain. And to my mind, it's his finest book in years. However, I do also kind of know what Ghosh means. As a solipsistic millennial, I'm aware that the solipsistic act of reading a novel that focuses on the inner life of one other solipsistic millennial is hardly the stuff of climate revolution, and in many ways encapsulates some of the reasons for how we got to where we are. Or maybe that's just my own crisis of confidence as a writer talking, combined with my heightened climate anxieties. But either way, I have found myself searching more and more for a new form. Brian Kulick, in his recent book, Staging the End of the World, Theatre in a Time of Climate Crisis, posits that, quote, part of the basic phenomenology of the theatre, in many ways, is to return us from the individual back to the collective. Even regardless of the play's topic, the very act of coming together as a group of strangers in a room to think and feel together is a hugely powerful and increasingly rare thing. As Byung-Chul Han argues, it's one of the few remaining secular forms of ritual. Meanwhile, composer Tom Parkinson argues that the very liveness of performance speaks directly to the contingency and the vulnerability of our planet and our current situation, the sense that anything could go wrong at any minute. As Parkinson says, quote, "There's something in the chaos of creativity that reminds us in the world, as in the rehearsal room, that things could be different, perhaps better." So, what of the climate plays themselves? In his book, Kulik gives a decent overview of some of the classics, from William Shakespeare's The Tempest to Samuel Beckett's Happy Days to Carol Churchill's Far Away. Back in London, I've seen some great contemporary examples. So Mike Bartlett's Earthquakes in London, Lucy Kirkwood's The Children, and Joe Murphy and Joe Robinson's extraordinary Kyoto, which dramatizes the events of the UN's landmark 1997 Kyoto Climate Conference. However, the most striking example, and the one I want to say a bit more about today, is 2025's Bog Witch, a one-woman play written by and starring the comedian, performance artist, writer, and all-round genius, Bryony Kimmings. Kimmings has talked about her long-held desire to make art in response to the climate emergency, but the fundamental difficulty of finding a way to do so effectively. She describes how what little climate-related art she has seen on screen and in theatres tends to try and tackle the issue as a whole, which is just too overwhelming for people to try and comprehend. Quote, "Humans are not designed to hold the woes of the whole planet. It is too much. Too scary," which in turn causes people to shut down and disengage. As such, Kimming says her number one priority when devising the play that ultimately became Bog Witch was to try and counteract this, quote, "to make it micro, personal, and wholly accessible, to mainstream the narrative, make it fun, make it stand up, make it normal to chat about in the pub or on your WhatsApp group or in the dog park." So, Bog Witch does indeed begin with a focus on the micro, a personal story wholly accessible in tone, a simple autobiographical piece about a woman named Bryony who leaves her busy capitalist London life to relocate to the British countryside. However, she admits she's not really doing this for any particularly idealistic reasons, more because she has fallen in love with a man. Quote, "a DILF, a rampant eco-warrior, a big, sexy geek." So as soon as Bryony arrives, she realizes she has made a mistake, because this is not just the countryside, this is, quote, "rural as fuck." Immediately she is bored, lonely. She sings silly songs about missing her air fryer and her Peloton and the ability to order cigarettes on Deliveroo even though the driver definitely hates her. She gently pokes fun at herself and her new neighbours, all of whom are weirdos who dress in hemp kaftans and eat tofu and smell funny, including one woman called Aster who has a silly voice and a heaving bosom, tits o'clock, and keeps nagging Bryony to join her and some friends on an eco-weekender. That is a weird hippie festival that revolves around some tribunal-style role-play event called the Council of All Beings. As Bryony confides in the audience, "It sounds like my worst nightmare. I wanted a mate to get pissed with, to slag people off with, not a planetary improv group to join." All this is very funny and very charming. However, as the play goes on, it steadily grows darker and more confronting. The veneer is stripped away to allow for genuine fear to creep in, a dawning sense that the air fryers and the Pelotons and the cigarettes from Deliveroo were only ways for Bryony to distract herself from a far more terrifying, far more existential dread, one that isn't just the remit of weirdos in hemp frocks, but everyone. And then, right at the end of the play, something shifts. Bryony not only attends the Council of All Beings, she actually enacts it right there on stage. She invites 12 audience members to join her and to put on some incredible animal costumes, and then walks us through the tribunal proceedings, while the humans, that is the rest of the audience, are invited to provide sound effects and answers to various call and response prompts. As Bryony explains, the idea is to create a moment of awe as well as a healing experience. Awe can be galvanizing and a form of collective therapy. You get the feeling of awe from staring at huge canyons or ancient trees, but you can also get it in large collections of people unified in one participatory thing. If this all sounds a bit mad, it is. But having experienced it, I can confirm it was also oddly, profoundly emotional. The audience that night came away feeling genuinely moved and united. For what started as a micro, personal, accessible show about one woman's half-assed quest for a greener life, ultimately concluded as a vast, awe-inspiring reminder of our interconnectedness and the power of the collective voice. The impact of that show, the sense of interconnectedness, stayed with me for weeks, not least since at the time I was in the process of writing my own very first play, which also dealt with climate concerns. I kept being reminded of Kulik's claim that, quote, part of the basic phenomenology of the theatre is, in many ways, to return us from the individual back to the collective. And I started to wonder if this new form I was trying, writing for the stage, was in fact better suited to what I wanted to say than a novel ever could be. However, the more I thought about it, the more I realised that unlike Kyoto or Happy Days or Earthquakes over London, Bogwitch hadn't just returned us back to the collective by virtue of us being in a room of strangers passively watching a piece of theatre together. Rather, by enacting the Council of All Beings on stage, a sort of play within a play, and inviting the audience to be directly involved, Kimmings had explicitly drawn attention to the thing we were already doing, that is, partaking in a secular ritual, using art as a way to talk and think together about our dying planet, to connect through a means of shared storytelling. And in this way, Kimmings's meta-theatrical device was making a case in both form and content for the role of art, and indeed the role of artists, at a time of crisis. And as an artist, that moved and interested me very much. So much I can't turn the page. So this brings me to the second train of thought I've been exploring recently, an emergent subgenre of the kinds of works I've been describing thus far. So not just writing in crisis, not just writing about crisis, but writing about writing in crisis. So rather than art simply being the vehicle to talk about urgent issues, or perhaps even to inspire urgent action, I've noticed a new trend where art has also become the subject matter of these texts, a metafictional or self-reflexive turn that invites us to ask, A, is art actually a meaningful way to mitigate the oncoming crises? B, if the world does end, what happens to art? And finally, C, but what if art is the thing in crisis? So, probably the most famous example of what I'm describing is Emily St. John Mandel's extraordinary 2014 novel, Station 11. For those of you who haven't read it, most of the story takes place 20 years after a flu virus has wiped out 99% of the population. We follow a nomadic group called the Travelling Symphony, who spend the year travelling across America, visiting the communities of survivors to perform classical music and Shakespeare plays. Alongside this, we're also offered flashbacks to life before society's collapse, focusing on a whole cast of interconnected characters. Upon its publication in 2014, the book was a runaway hit. It won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, it was a finalist for the National Book Award, also a finalist for the PEN Faulkner Award, and readers praised its ambition and its aching beauty. And then, of course, 6 years later, the world was hit with its very own virus, and Station 11 enjoyed a fresh round of attention, people staggered by how uncannily familiar it felt to our own present situation. However, on rereading the novel in the depths of lockdown, for me, what was most interesting, beyond the ambition or the aching beauty or the uncanny familiarity, was what the book had to say about the role of art and artists, especially when the world has been turned upside down. So, the Travelling Symphony is always on the move, moving between the few remaining communities accompanied by 3 caravans painted with the words, "Survival is insufficient." Unsurprisingly, the idea of survival runs throughout the novel. Obviously, these performers somehow managed to survive the flu, as well as the violence of the early post-pandemic years. But what they're doing now is so much more than simply outrunning death, because art has elevated their existence to something beyond mere survival, just as it continues to elevate the communities they visit. The audiences are always enraptured and profoundly grateful. Here then we start to get the sense of artists performing a key cultural role, perhaps even occupying a superior societal position. As the symphony often reminds themselves, what they were doing was noble. The only problem with "Survival is insufficient" is its source. All I'm saying, Dieter, one of the Travelling Symphony's members, points out, is that quote would be way more profound if we hadn't lifted it from Star Trek. Kirsten, the novel's protagonist, objects. She loves the quote, has it tattooed on her skin, but this only fuels Dieter's argument. See, that illustrates the whole problem. The best Shakespearean actress in the territory, and her favourite line of text is from Star Trek. It is here we start to wonder whether the Travelling Symphony, and indeed the novel as a whole, is making a case for art in general, or just a certain kind of art, something we might call high art, the classics, art that is quote unquote important. We are told in the early days, the symphony did try performing some more modern plays, but that audiences just seemed to prefer Shakespeare. As Dieter says, people want what was best about the world. So what makes Shakespeare best? On the one hand, Shakespeare might be lauded as a pertinent choice, given he too survived and lost loved ones to a vicious plague. However, this connection is only made very fleetingly in the novel, and only ever by the omniscient narrator, never by the actors or audiences themselves. Meanwhile, Shakespeare's plays are often deliberately chosen to avoid being too pertinent. For example, at one point, the symphony arrive in a gloomy town where things feel somewhat amiss, so they decide against performing a tragedy. Quote, "I don't know that we want to make this place more depressing." Instead, they opt for A Midsummer Night's Dream. As the director says, "I believe this evening calls for fairies." This tendency towards enchantment, this instinct towards offering a distraction or a temporary means of escape, is encapsulated by the outfits they choose to wear while performing. What the symphony was doing, what they were always doing, was trying to cast a spell, and costuming helped. The lives they brushed up against were work-worn and difficult, people who spent all their time engaged in the tasks of survival. A few of the actors thought Shakespeare would be more relatable if they dressed in the same patched and faded clothing their audience wore, but Kirsten thought it meant something to see Titania in a gown, Hamlet in a shirt and tie. The tuba agreed with her. "The thing with the new world," the tuba had once said, "it's just horrifically short on elegance." So, a distinction is being drawn between art on the one hand and reality on the other, between the beautiful past and the depressing, work-worn, inelegant present. Art, in a time of crisis, is seen as a means of escape. The novel concludes in an airport, where the Travelling Symphony discover a thriving community they hadn't realised existed before. They also discover the airport is home to a facility known as the Museum of Civilization, where objects from before society's collapse are collected and arranged, practical things now rendered obsolete and thus imbued with a sense of nostalgia and beauty. A games console, a passport, a pair of red stiletto heels, all curated and placed inside a glass case so that no grubby fingerprints can spoil them. Critic Pieter Vermeulen has argued the Museum of Civilization serves as a metaphor for the novel's entire aesthetic programme. That is, its overarching emphasis on preserving elegance, keeping it fenced off from real life. We think again of Dieter's remarks about wanting to protect what was best of the world. And there is so much more I could say about Station 11, about the other forms of art that do creep in, about the incredible TV adaptation, which I actually think is better than the novel, and I never say that, but please watch it. However, with what time I have left, I would like to turn to another text which came out in 2014 and which also explicitly explores the role of art and artists during a catastrophe in ways that really speak to and build on everything we've discussed so far. So, Mr. Burns is a piece of theatre written by the American playwright Anne Washburn. It opens with 4 people sitting around a campfire, chatting and laughing, trying to remember a particular episode of The Simpsons. The scene is familiar. The dialogue perfectly encapsulates the excitement, the frustration, the competitiveness of people, of aficionados, trying to piece together something from memory. After a while, there's a noise in the bushes. The characters dismiss it as just a deer, but then they hear another noise. A man emerges from the bushes, hands raised, and at gunpoint they quiz him about who he is, where he has come from, what he has seen. And it's only here, roughly 10 minutes into the play, that we start to understand what is going on beyond the confines of this idyllic fireside scene. As the man speaks, we pick up on certain words: barricade, evacuation, quarantine. And over the next few minutes, other phrases allow us to piece together the following information. There has been a nuclear accident in America. There are very few survivors. These people are not on a camping trip, not talking about The Simpsons for the fun of it, but as a way to distract themselves, to stay awake, to find some comfort in the familiar, because right now the situation is completely unknown and completely terrifying. Eventually, they let the stranger join them. He offers the line of Simpsons dialogue they were trying to remember. The group is surprised and then grateful. And it's only at this point that they introduce themselves by name. Before they were just strangers, just survivors. Now, through a shared cultural bond, they are made human. They connect. So, at the end of this scene is the first interval of the play. And when we return for Act 2, a projection on the back wall tells us that it is 7 years later. The world, the play, has moved on. So now, rather than just sitting around remembering The Simpsons, the characters from Act 1 have formed, wait for it, a travelling group of actors and musicians. And they make their way around North America, visiting the few communities of survivors. One character estimates there's an after population of 1 million. Their repertoire includes old Simpsons episodes, as well as pop songs from the year of the fallout, such as, great choice, Britney Spears' Toxic. So, unlike the Travelling Symphony, however, this group is not the only one of its kind. And we soon learn about their competitors. Groups called the Primetime Players, the Reruns, one called simply, nostalgically, Thursday Night. And these rival collectors endeavour to stand out from one another by having the most elaborate costumes, the most impressive Britney harmonies. But another way to trump their competitors is through the sheer number of shows, that is, the number of complete episodes they have in their repertoire. Because, of course, unlike the Travelling Symphony, what all these groups lack is any scripts. Instead, all the people have for The Simpsons is their memory. And so, over the last 7 years, a black market or trading network has emerged specifically for lines of Simpsons dialogue. Sometimes groups buy them from brokers. Sometimes they barter between themselves according to which episodes they have in their catalogue. And this increasingly desperate act of collective remembrance calls to mind the play's opening scene. It also calls to mind the Museum of Civilization, the desire to meticulously arrange and preserve fragments of the before. The difference here is that audiences actually pay to attend each group's performances, trading supplies and tools for the pleasure. So art, entertainment, is both an escape from survival, but also a way for the groups themselves to keep acquiring the things they literally need to survive. And this economic reality tempers the idea of art as a purely noble pursuit, gesturing towards something far more practical or prosaic. And meanwhile, within the group itself, there are increasing tensions around what exactly their role or purpose is. In arguments that directly recall some of the language of the Travelling Symphony, the characters in Mr. Burns debate the difference between high and low culture, between the function of art in times of crisis, between pure escapism versus the opportunity to speak to the present moment. Quincy says, this is a cartoon. That's what we're doing, a cartoon. You keep trying to turn it into drama. And Maria says, I'm just saying, I think we have a chance to engage at the same time with larger, are we just entertaining them? We have an opportunity here to provide meaning. And Quincy says, meaning is everywhere. We get meaning for free, whether we like it or not. Meaningless entertainment, on the other hand, is actually really hard. So in an interview about the play's inception, Anne Washburn described her interest in, quote, taking a TV show and pushing it forward past the apocalypse and seeing what would happen. She suspected that in the first instance, people would find comfort in pop culture purely because of its familiarity, prioritizing exactitude, the way it is for small kids after a crisis, the way it is for anyone after a crisis. We really want to remember how things were. However, over time, Washburn says, quote, as the situation stabilizes, people gradually start to use entertainment as a way of talking about where they are now, thinking about now. And sure enough, in the third act of Mr. Burns, the situation has stabilized as we jump forward 75 years after the nuclear collapse. And the characters are now dressed like a psychedelic Greek chorus, performing a highly stylized, almost ceremonial Simpsons-inspired piece. The songs are a mixture of old advertising jingles, Britney Spears lyrics, and lines from the Bible. The dances combine primitive movements with itchy and scratchy slapstick routines. There are moments derived from specific scenes we witnessed earlier in the play, all centered around the story of an explosion in a nuclear power plant. And this climactic, post-apocalyptic bonanza is a melting pot of high and low art, of entertainment and meaning, artifice and real life. As I said, elements from the now quite distant before have been reimagined, transformed into something that speaks to the new world, offering a sense of optimism for the future. As such, unlike in Station 11, art's role in the face of crisis is not simply to offer an escape, to preserve what was best of the world, to remain untouched and unchanged. Instead, it offers a space to directly reflect on and think through the urgent issues of the time, to hold up a mirror to the crisis itself. As theatre critic Cassie Tung writes, Mr. Burns, quote, is an acknowledgement of the potential of theatre itself, how it provides a space for ritual in a secular world, a communal opportunity for feeling and reflection, how, when at its best, art changes with the times to best serve the people who will see it. Despite their differing arguments, however, it is fair to say that both Station 11 and Mr. Burns ultimately offer narratives of hope, suggesting that art, be it high art or low art, will be the thing to bind us in the face of disaster, to offer some comfort or release. Furthermore, like Bog Witch's play within a play, through their play within a novel and TV show within a play, they explicitly draw attention to themselves as works of art, making a case for the role culture can play at a time of crisis. However, to conclude, I would like to mention a couple of other metatextual examples which are not so optimistic. The performance, by Australian novelist Claire Thomas, for example, centres around 3 women in a Melbourne theatre watching a production of Beckett's Happy Days while terrible bushfires rage nearby. But rather than this seminal climate play rousing the audience to action, they simply sit, distracted, entertained, as the flames near closer and closer. Art does not save them. In fact, it does the opposite. And meanwhile, Korean-American author Joo-Hye's Kim short story Mountain Island, from her collection A Love Story from the End of the World, is set in the near future on an island of trash, a literal wasteland of capitalist detritus, where orphaned children try to survive their toxic surroundings. Along the way, we are offered brief vignettes of the global K-pop band KBB, with which the orphans, like everyone else on the planet, are obsessed. But where the narrative seems to set up the possibility that this band, or at least their viral music, might somehow save these poor children from their awful fate, in the end, no such redemption comes to pass. In her acknowledgements at the end of the collection, Kim writes, quote, "If you are an artist, it is not conscionable to use our ecological catastrophe for fiction and not personally do something to help." For her, then, the fiction is not the doing, and as far as she's concerned, it is certainly not going to help. So, maybe art won't save the world. And maybe, contrary to what St. John Mandel and Washburn and others suggest, art won't be saved. In the face of AI and arts cuts and a crisis of the humanities, maybe Shakespeare and Beckett and K-pop won't be the things to survive, to bind us when all else is lost. Or maybe what I'm saying is that art and artists, more than ever, need to consider not only the role they can play in mitigating other crises, for example, the climate emergency, they also need to consider the role art and artists can play in mitigating the crisis of art, that is, their very own, very pressing emergency. And crucially, to consider what form that case, that mitigation, might take. Merci beaucoup.